Well, as we begin, a little backstory on me. I remember it was about 15 years ago. My wife and I were at a camp in Texas. I was speaking to some high school students, and we left the camp that afternoon to just go and hang out in the city, and we sat at a coffee shop. And while we were there, this young man stole my wife's iPhone, literally ripped her earbuds out and went running out the door, which was interesting because you always kind of wonder, what would my instinctual response be? My wife's was to yell. And she yelled, "Get him, babe." Which at that point, what are you gonna do? Be like, "No, thank you, I'm good." Keep sipping my latte. So I ran out the door in my flip-flops after this young man, and we turned this corner, and I saw a security car pull up. So I yelled to security, "Hey, he's got my phone." And then in a moment later realized, oh, that's his buddy driving the security car. Not sure how they procured that, but that was the getaway vehicle. And so all in a moment, he jumped in the car, I grabbed the door, and his buddy hit the gas. And the three of us went driving down the road together. The two of them in the vehicle, me hanging from the side. Which again was interesting because they were the same age as the kids I had just been preaching to. So I was talking to them in a normal voice like this, like, "Hey guys, you don't want to do this." And they were talking back to me, calling me sir. It was all a bit surreal. But at some point I realized I gotta make a choice. Like, I'm either gonna escalate this thing and like get in the vehicle or just let it go. And I realized it's just a phone, man. So I let go of the car and watched them drive off, and then actually watched them get stopped and get arrested, which I had mixed feelings about, just praying for these young men and where their life's going, and please pray for them too. But I remember at the end of that, walking back to my wife, and as the adrenaline sapped out of my body, I told her, "My back hurts." And then the next day it hurt a little bit more. And then in the third day, there was excruciating pain radiating down my lower back into my feet, and I couldn't walk, I couldn't sit up. And several MRIs and doctor's visits later, we found out that I had multiple bulging discs and a herniated disc that was pressing 3 centimeters into my spine, causing waves of pain and causing me to lose the use of my right foot. And so I remember as we met with this surgeon, I was like, "Hey, can you get this thing moving? Because I got a ministry about to start, I need to go." And I remember him saying, "Hey, I need to acclimate you to your new reality." He said, he pointed at Donna, who was pregnant with our firstborn at the time, and he said, "You can't help her. I don't know that you'll be physically able to hold that baby." He said, "And I can't fix you." He said, "You've got multiple pre-existing issues. No surgical option is gonna help you." And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "And if that foot drops, you won't walk again." And I said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Go home and hope that your back heals itself." And so I went home and I laid on the floor in my living room for a month. Lost a bunch of weight, sick, taking drugs. It made it hard to sleep. And I remember at one moment as I was on the floor, like anytime the AC kicked on, just the shimmy on the floor would make waves of pain shoot through my body. And so I was praying like, "God, would you just please make this stop? Like, would you make this cease happening? Like, you're a good father. If I'm your son, like, would you relieve this pain? Would you take this away? You can do it in a minute. Would you do it?" And as I was praying that, because all the drugs in my system, I got the hiccups. Which at that moment, my prayer shifted to something like, "Really?" And I suddenly started asking questions that were somewhere along the lines of, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right? Now, why do I bring that up? Because we're wrapping up a series today about questions that people ask God. And we got these questions, I mentioned last week, from HarperCollins, our ministry partner that did research on generations in America and found the top searched questions about God. Why does God, and what do people fill in that Google kind of prompts you? And the number one most prompted question was, why does God allow suffering? And we talked about that a few weeks ago. Why does he allow pain in the world? And then last week we talked about the second most popular question, why does God hate me? Which is a tragic question. And now this week I want to ask and answer the third most answered question, and it's the one that I was praying on the floor to some degree. Why does God test us? Why does God test me? Now what's interesting about that is last week the question was, why does God hate me? And the answer was basically, he doesn't. But let's talk about why you feel that way. This question is, why does God test me? And the answer is basically, oh, you bet he does. Buckle up, son. Now we got to figure out why. But let's ask the how question first. Does God tempt you? You bet. He'll tempt you in a number of ways. He'll tempt you with pain. He will put you in a difficult circumstance on purpose. That's what we just saw in our text. He said, I led you into that great and terrible wilderness. And what I love about that is he calls it great and terrible. That's God. And he's like, I led you into the wilderness, which, by the way, that place was terrible. I mean, were you guys hot? Holy meat, there were scorpions there. You remember that? That was crazy. And you're like, God, that was your desert. Are you serious? I think it's deeply ironic, by the way, that on the day we preach about God testing us is the day the AC breaks in this building. The irony's not lost on me. I brought a sweater to preach in today, and God's like, not so fast. I'm gonna make you live this out, son. So welcome to the living illustration. But he'll test you by putting you in painful situations. He'll test you with prosperity. One of the most dangerous things that can happen is when you start to win. We'll talk about that more later. He'll test you with praise. Proverbs 27 says, the crucible for silver, the furnace for gold, but a man is tested by his praise. What happens to your ego when someone starts to stroke it? Right? Or he'll test you by pulling back. That's what he did to Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles 32. He said, I'm gonna put you in a situation where you have to make a decision, and I'm not going to intervene with divine intervention. I'm just gonna let you make the call and let you see what happens next. So he'll bring pain, he'll bring praise, he'll bring prosperity, and he'll just pull back. He'll do all different kinds of things. He will test you. Jeremiah called him, O Lord of hosts, who judges rightly and tests the heart and the mind. That's his name, according to the prophet Jeremiah. So now the question is, if he does that, why? Why does he test us? Ultimately, what is his purpose? Then why does he put us through the particular tests he does? And then how do we respond when he does? Those are our three questions. What's his ultimate purpose? Why does he test us? And how do we respond? And we're gonna get to all of them in this passage in Deuteronomy. I just typed in test and did a little search of how often God tests us. There were over 40 passages in the Bible, and I thought about teaching them all, but then I realized, no, we need to get y'all out of here by lunch. But we've taught on this subject before, from the book of James, from 1 Peter, from Exodus. We'll post those later this week. We'll come at it from different angles. We may not get to all your questions today, but we're gonna focus in on one text, Deuteronomy 8, because this is a key pivot point where God reveals the why. He's talking to the people of God that he set free from slavery in Egypt and led through the wilderness, the desert, on the way to the promised land. And now here, right at the edge between pain and prosperity, God stops to remind them of the past, to prepare them for the future. And in that moment, he starts to talk about what he did and why. And it illuminates not just their story, but ours as well. And so when we look at it in verse 1, we get the answer of God's ultimate purpose for his people when he brings trial. And in verse 1, he says, the whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do. And then he gives two reasons why. That you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. He says, I'm gonna give you a way of seeing and engaging life, and you need to be careful to do it. Why? And he gives you two reasons. Number one is really, in a sense, the fulfillment for God's mandate for humanity, given in Genesis 1 and 2. When God created men and women in his image, the first commands were given are to be fruitful and multiply, to be people who thrive. That's what he says here, that I want you to live and multiply. I want you to fulfill your created potential. I want you to live a life that thrives and multiplies, means that you would have kids, you would grow as a community, and as you grow as a community and young people join it, you use your gifts to build each other up. I want you to be fruitful and multiply. It's fun, one of the first audio Bibles we bought our kids had a little like kid translation of that passage, and they translated be fruitful and multiply as have babies, is how the guy said it. And you're like, yeah, I mean, that's a key part of it, very fun part of it. But the idea is that at every level, you would thrive as a community, that you would grow together and reach your potential. And then in the next part, he says, and you would go in and possess the land that I promised to your fathers. That's not just a statement about real estate. And I want you to get some good property. It'll be great. It'll appreciate in value. That's not what he's saying. He said, no, I promised this land to your forefathers with a purpose. He's talking about Abraham, Genesis 12. That God grabbed Abraham and said, hey, I need you to move. And when you get to the land I want you in, I'm gonna bless you. And then he says, and it's not just for you, I'm gonna bless you so that you will be a blessing and every family on the earth will be blessed through you. And so we've talked about this before. I won't belabor it here, but I'll show you on a map here. God moved Abraham hundreds of miles to that little strip of green on the one place on the planet that connects 3 major continents. That God does not keep his people safe out away from the culture. He puts you right in the dead center of the city. That's what God does, right? Why does he put them there? He says, I'm gonna bless you there so that you will be a blessing, that all the nations would know me. And so God says, man, I want you to be a thriving community and I wanna give you a thrilling cause that you can be a part of the great campaign of helping people know the God who made them and be a part of what he's made them to do. That's God's ultimate purpose. I want your good and my glory. That I want to do good for you so you can bring glory to me so that the world might know me. That's his ultimate purpose, the answer to the first question. Why does God put us in the situations he does? It's for your good and for his glory, that you would be a part of a thriving community with a thrilling cause, which incidentally is the longing of every human heart. We all want to be a part of a community where we're loved and known and cared about. And we all want to be a part of a cause that's bigger than us and worthy of our lives. And we're not meant to just go find one. And yet that drives us so many different places. That longing for community and cause is what drives some of us into political parties and drives others into street gangs. It can drive some of the most heroic acts of self-sacrifice and some of the most selfish acts that you experienced in middle school. That someone will mock somebody else to be in with the cool crowd. That a longing for community and a longing for cause is hardwired into the human soul. And God says, that's because you're meant to be a part of my ultimate community for my ultimate cause. I want you to be a part of what I'm doing in you and through you, right? So if that's true, then the question is, then why do you test us? How does that relate? Why do you put us in uncomfortable situations? Why do you put us in difficult places? Why the wilderness? Well, it's interesting. The first thing you got to wonder is, God says, I'm doing this for your good and my glory. And so at the root of all these questions from the series is, do you believe that? Do you trust in the character of God? That's really the root question. When you can't trace his hand, do you trust his heart? And the answer for some of us, if you're honest, is no. I don't know if I trust him. And if that is your answer, let me just say, I am so glad you're here. Because your presence here, unless you were lied to or tricked by your friend, you showed up here because you're looking for an answer. I want to know if God is worthy of my trust. If you're one of the people who Googled, why does God test me? It's because you want to know, does God really have a reason that's good? And I think it's wise because here's the deal. God's not going away. He's going to be here and he's going to keep running the world you live in. So unless you want to live a life that's thoroughly confused and frustrated, it behooves you to cross the room at the party and introduce yourself to him. So God, what's your deal, right? And so I'm glad you're here trying to figure this out. Is he worthy of my trust? Well, let's ask the next question. Why does he test us? And we get the first reason in verse 2. He says, and you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commands or not. First reason why he tests us is for evaluation, to know what's in your heart, to evaluate you. It's the same reason why your teachers test you. When you took a test in class, it's to show what you know, right? Now, some of you go, well, why does God need to test me to show what I know? If God knows everything, he already knows what I know. Why would he test me to do that? Well, if you had a good teacher, say in math, if they really knew you, they could probably guess what you're about to get on the test, right? And yet they give you one, why? To have a paper trail for you and them, that the world can see, here's where you are. This difficulty exposes your deficiency, and it gives us a starting place from which to move you. Because anybody can talk, but your actions betray what you really believe. I remember I watched a video years ago. It was from a buddy of mine who was training in law enforcement. He was showing me this deal where they trained for like active shooter scenarios. And this was one where they let civilians in who were training for to carry a handgun. And they were interviewing this one guy beforehand, the civilian kid that was going to go to this handgun training thing. And beforehand, he was just talking up a huge game. Yeah, I know my way around all kinds of weapon systems. I can't be stopped. I'm the most accurate person in the history of the planet. I mean, the guy was insufferably arrogant. I'm gonna crush this test. So they put him in this room that looks like a town hall meeting, and he knows it's gonna be a test where like an active shooter's gonna break out, and so you know it's a test, and yet you don't know who it is, you don't know when it's gonna be, and so you can see everyone in the room is a little bit amped. And sure enough, at one moment, somebody stands up in this little drill, pulls out a gun, it's an active shooter scenario, loud bangs going off, suddenly you got this active moment, and as they're filming this thing, this kid that had talked so big, within less than 2 seconds, leapt out the back door and disappeared, leaving his fiance sitting by herself in the arena. And so the instructor stopped the deal and said, let's start with you. And he pointed at the fiance and he's like, I noticed your husband bailed immediately without you. How did it feel for him to abandon you in that violent situation? And she was like, not very good. He's like, exactly. And this kid just got a rush of information. You go, man, he is in trouble. Not just is he failing this class, he's failing fiance. Like, this is not good, son, right? But it was informative. That evaluation shows you where you are. And that's what God says. I'm going to do that for you. I'm going to show you where you're at. Now you go, but if he knows everything, why would he do that? He likes to let our lives play out in reality. It's the same answer for why do you pray? Well, why would I pray to God if he knows everything? Well, I think of when my daughter goes off to college, I want to ask her about her day. And it's not just that I want the data. I could stalk her online. I could read her social media posts. I could track her on Find My Phone and know exactly her whereabouts. But that's not a relationship. I want to commune with her heart as we talk about the data of her day. And here God says, I just want to show you where you're at because difficulty exposes deficiency. And we need to see where we need work. My kids and I were watching a video the other day of Boss Rutan, who's hilarious. He was the king of MMA when it was first emerging as a sport, mixed martial arts. And there's this video where this guy wants to train in MMA and he's telling Boss about all of his exploits and how talented he is. And so Boss says, well, before I train you, let's evaluate you. I'm gonna put you in some moves and you show me that you can escape. And he puts him in a chokehold, the guy has to tap out. Puts him in an arm bar, the guy has to tap out. Puts him in a knee bar, the guy has to tap out. And at the end of it, Boss goes, you're vulnerable, like a puppy. And I was like, what a great... Where the guy was talking a big game before, now he has the humility enough to listen. You're right, I am like a puppy. Will you teach me? And so God evaluates us, not to crush us, but to instruct us. And that's the second point. Why does he test you? Why will he put you in difficult spaces? Because when you're squeezed, we see what comes out of you. And sometimes we don't like what we see. But he doesn't do it to shame you. He does it to help you. It's for education as well as evaluation. That's what you get in verse 3. He humbled you and he let you hunger. And then he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Notice that's the next motivation, that you might know something. Part of this test was to teach you, that you may know there's a way of living life that's insufficient. He says, you're in danger of just eating food, getting things, getting money to make a living, to buy things you want, and then just living this little lower story and dying. And I needed you to see there's a bigger story playing out. And if you just go into this land where you farm, which is what they're about to do, and he told them later, you may farm and think, well, I'm doing this all myself. I'm self-sufficient because look what I do. And you'll forget, no, God makes things grow. So I put you in this weird situation with this random stuff manna that would be on the ground, not because you would rely on me to provide that way, but so that I could give you that beautiful combination of agency that you would go pick it up, but the humility to know, but it's God who fed me, because it's the same everywhere in life. And God is trying to sync them up in reality, that sometimes God will introduce pain to give us perspective because we get a very narrow view of life. And he has to wake us up and go, no, there's a bigger story. You did not make all this. I'm not trying to crush your agency, but I'm trying to give you humility that you know you're not supposed to just get a job to live by bread alone. There's a Lord who is speaking, and you're meant to sync up your life with him. It's interesting. We love stories like this, where we want a hero who's a mix of humility and courage, right? Think about Iron Man. How did that movie start? He was insufferable because he was wealthy. His dad had made all this wealth, so he grew up with everything's at my fingertips. And when you got all the prosperity you want, you can start thinking that the world revolves around you. And so what happened? Well, they kicked him out into the desert, and he lived in a cave in the desert that humbled him and tested him. Where do they get these ideas? And in that cave, what happened? He realized, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe what I thought was important doesn't really matter. Maybe there's some other things that do matter. And it didn't crush his sense of agency. He still had to hammer out a little suit to get out of there, but he had to get a renovated heart so he could emerge from that cave, not crushed by his humility, but combining that humility and confidence to forge him into a hero, one that we cheer for and has made billions for his company, right? That we love the mix of courage and humility, but we're not always certain how to get it. And yet God says, that's why I put you in the wilderness. It's a place to show you you are not self-sufficient. I'm not trying to rob you of agency, but I'm trying to combine your agency with humility because that makes a beautiful human and it syncs you up with reality. One of my favorite TV shows is called Alone. I don't know if you've ever seen that show. The premise is they take these people and just put them alone out in the wilderness. And whoever survives wins. It's a very simple premise. And the first season is kind of wild because it's all these like 40-somethings who think they're gonna find themselves in the wilderness while they're having like an identity crisis. They're like, I just wanna commune with nature. And then like 3 days later, they're eating dirt, like, I'm so hungry. And you realize like, yeah, there's no answers out there, boss. And, but as it goes by, each successive season, these like hardcore survivalists start entering the chat. I mean, you get by season 15, 16, there are people that sew all their own clothing out of pelts, right? The only music they listen to is from a drum they made from the skin of a squirrel. I mean, you're like, okay, you people are not like the rest of us. They know how to set little squirrel traps and they know how to make fishing nets and they know how to do all this stuff. And you can see at the beginning of each season a little bit of arrogance. They're just like, I know how to survive. I can trap a squirrel. I can catch a fish. I can build a shelter. I cannot be stopped. I am a survivor, right? And they just, you feel that coming off them and they go out there and set all their little traps and get their little gill nets and they do all their little stuff. And then they suddenly dawns on them, oh, I can have all these skills, but if there's no squirrels, I'm dead. If the fish don't bite, I starve. And after a while, you see this humility set in. And so when they do find some food, you see this explosion of gratitude. And sometimes they don't even know who to be grateful to, but they realized, oh, there's a limits to what I can do in the world. There's more going on than just me. And often when they leave the show, whether they win or not, they're so grateful for the pain of the wilderness because it taught them humility and grace. It didn't crush them, it matured them. And that's what he's talking about here. I humbled you and tested you so that you would know man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word from the mouth of God. There's a God who made you, and he's not trying to rob from you agency. He's trying to add to it humility. That you were made by God on purpose for a purpose, and you're meant to ask him, Lord, why am I here? And what exactly is it you want me to be a part of? And what he does in that wilderness too is not just educate you, but prepare you. That's the next one. It's for evaluation, it's for education, it's for preparation, to get you ready for what's next. He says in verse 4, your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell those 40 years. I love that, because I don't know if it's true, but in my mind in verse 4, I always think that maybe they didn't realize that before. Like they knew the manna was from God. But I just feel like in this moment, he's like, did you notice your sandals never worn out? And I imagine them going like, huh, I think he's got a point. Here, I just thought the Egyptians made a great sandal. How about that? Yeah, maybe God was providing for me in ways I never thought about. And then he says, know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. A good dad doesn't discipline his son to crush him. He disciplines his son to shape him, to make a useful tool in the world. And he says, that's how you're supposed to see testing. It's not to hurt you, it's to help you. That's what a good dad does. Because I knew I was going to put you in a situation where a bigger test was coming, prosperity. And in that prosperity, you may get so wrapped up with money, wealth, and power that you forget that there's a God who has a bigger story for you, and you'll waste your life. One of the gifts God gave me when I was laid out on that floor in pain was I realized there were all kinds of things I cared about that in the final equation didn't amount to anything. And there were things that meant a lot that I was neglecting. And God recalibrated my perspective to prepare me when he gave me my legs back to be a better minister and a better leader and a better husband and a better dad. It was a gift, a bruising blessing, a severe mercy, right? And so he says, I want to prepare you for the next thing because challenges are coming. And so I put you in a situation where you were desperately aware of your need for me so that when you're not desperate for me, you'll still remember me and still remember I'm there. I'm preparing you in the pain for the prosperity of the future. That's the next reason. It's for preparation. That's why God will test you. Karate Kid taught us this. One of my favorite moments of the last few years, my wife and I showed our kids the movie Karate Kid, and we did not tell them anything about it. Everyone knows the story, but not my children. They had no idea what was coming. We didn't even tell them what it was about. They're like, is it about karate? And you're like, probably, it's hard to say. And we just turned it on. And so they're watching little Ralph Macchio get beat up by people dressed as skeletons. It's all very stressful. And they see Miyagi agree to teach him, and then they watch as Miyagi makes him wax on, wax off. And then when he shows them every car, one of my kids went, that's messed up. He's got to do every car? I was like, I guess. And then they saw him sand the floor. And they're like, he's going to have to sand all the floor? And I remember when he was doing the painting one of our kids was like, this is wrong. He's just abusing, he's just using him. I don't like Miyagi at all. And I loved it because they had no idea. It's like hook, set, you know. Everyone knows this story, not my kids. And so I'm watching them when the moment comes when Miyagi's like, show me wax on, wax off. And they start to see he's been training him this whole time. My kids were like, wait, he was teaching him karate? What? And I had to pause and I was like, not only was he teaching karate, notice how scrawny he is. He was building up his shoulder muscles so he could. He's working at multiple levels. That's the level Miyagi's on. Get on to his level. And my kids are like, that is crazy. And I'm like, and you know what? It's just like Jesus, kids. It's just like Jesus. This is what he does to us. He's gonna put you in a test. Not to crush you, but to forge character into you, to keep you from wasting your life in shallow waters when he made you for so much more. And he'll put you in the pain, not to hurt you, but to prepare you for your God-given destiny. This is how he works. So when you get to the promised land, you can do it right. That you can be a kingdom of priests. You can be a holy nation. You can declare to people the faithfulness of God because they watch you hold on to him, even in hardship. I read a book years ago called Crazy for the Storm, and it was this son whose dad would put him in difficult situations all the time. Put him at the top of a mountain and said, ski down when the kid's like 5. And the kid's freaking out. I don't know how to do this. He's literally out over his skis. And the dad lets his son feel the deficiency inside, and then the dad begins to show him, here's how you make your way down a mountain. Takes him out into the ocean and lets him feel they're bigger forces than you in the world. These waves are massive, but then teaches them, here's how to not fight the waves, but to ride them. Right? And so then the son, when he was in middle school, was in a plane that crashed into the side of a mountain and everyone died but him. And yet this little middle school boy was able to walk down the side of a mountain in a snowstorm and survive. And on his way down, he realized, I can stay calm and I can survive because my dad forged into me what I needed for this moment. My dad was crazy for the storm, and he taught me how to survive and thrive in a difficult day. That's what your God's like. He's like a father disciplining his sons. Producing in you steadfastness is what James will say. Testing can produce something. One of my favorite historical figures is Ulysses S. Grant. Boy, you want to talk about somebody who knew how to lose. Sheesh, you read about him in his 20s and his 30s, After he graduated from West Point, he invested in a store in San Francisco, and the shop owner took his money and ran. And so then he had to get into a new line of work, and he found out that people who are getting ice way up in the north, they'll pay a premium for it down further south in California. So he invested his money in ice, and then it got stuck on a boat, and all the ice melted. So he invested in chickens, and they all died. Then he became a farmer, and his land was flooded. And that's just the beginning. It gets so much worse with dysfunctional families and multiple lost businesses until finally at one point, after being cheated and stolen and poor, he is selling firewood on the side of the road, one of the lowest jobs you can get in the day. Other West Point grads would look at him and say, "What happened to Grant?" And what you saw was a man who was being beaten down by life. He had to endure, and he never gave up. And then mid-30s, this man who God made persevere found himself in the middle of a civil war. And as he had to persevere in the war, he realized, I have the tools to do that. And so Abraham Lincoln put him over the entire army, and in his first major engagement with Lee, a horrific battle in Virginia, over 20,000 lives lost. And the Union soldiers, who were used to inept generals that would always retreat after battle, said, hey, this was a rough battle. Obviously, we're going to retreat. This whole enterprise is in doubt. And then they heard a distant hoofbeat. And then suddenly they record seeing emerge from the trees a 5'7", 135-pound Ulysses S. Grant, riding his horse not away from the battle, but towards it. And they said, when we watched him, even in the midst of difficulty, ride towards Richmond, not away from it, we knew we were going to win because we had a leader who knew how to endure. And you don't necessarily get endurance and wisdom from pain, but pain holds the potential for it if you're trained by it. And God says, I put you in the wilderness to train you, to do good for you in the end. That's why I did it. Do you believe it? Well, let me give you a spoiler alert as we close. Moses gives them this command. They go into the land and they do everything they're not supposed to do. I mean, it's a total mess, right? I mean, it does not work, okay? And it goes so bad that finally God says, you're worse than the other nations that I had to drive out of here. And he kicks them out. And you realize, remembering the Lord, following his commands, they demonstrably don't do it. They get another chance to do it and demonstrably don't do it. And if you read the Bible seriously, you realize God is faithful, but every man is a liar. So if I just give you 3 happy steps to be obedient to God, let me tell you something. You'll just be the next chapter of somebody that can't. Well, thanks, Ben. I'm so encouraged to be here in this hot room. Why are we doing this? How do we respond to the test? Well, let me just point you to the one verb that's repeated over and over again. Remember, remember. Notice he doesn't tell them, remember how to do this and how to do that. He says, remember me, the Lord who rescued you. Remember me, the Lord who fed you. Remember me, the Lord who gave you a drink. So whether it's pain or prosperity, you'll remember me, and I will give you life, and I will give you community and a cause. Remember me. Your hope and mine is clinging to the God who made us in his image and for his glory. And here's the crazy thing. This passage is quoted multiple times in the New Testament, and never with commands of what you're supposed to do per se, but it shows us the secret to what we're meant to remember. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus at the beginning of his ministry goes into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. And you go, why is he doing that? The Son of God becomes the Son of Man. And if God's people suffered in the wilderness, the Son of God says, then I will enter the wilderness too. And Jesus suffers hunger in the wilderness. And in the midst of the test comes the temptation. And the devil comes to him and says, if you really are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. And Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 8. He says, man shall not live by bread alone, but at every word that comes from the mouth of God. You're trying to get me to abandon God and go for mine? No, I submit to him because I trust my Father. And you see, Jesus succeeds in the wilderness where we fail. Then It's a fascinating moment. Did you notice Moses mentioned early on fiery serpents? That's not just mentioning that there were snakes all through the wilderness. There was a moment in their time in the wilderness where they were persistently disobedient against God, and God told them, hey, if you persist in disobedience, there will be judgment. Sometimes our pain is a direct result of our sin. Not always. You can never always draw that straight line. The book of Job teaches us that. Sometimes we're in a broken world. Sometimes God has purposes beyond what we can see. And yet for them, they persisted in disobedience, and fiery serpents came in and bit them, and they were dying. And then God gave Moses this really weird solution. He said, make a bronze serpent and put it up on a staff, and everyone who looks at it will be healed. And it's one of those stories you read in the book of Exodus and you go, that's the Bible being weird again. Like, what on earth is that? And yet the profound nature of that is, my choices led me not to life, but to a sickness unto death. And God's solution is I have to look up and acknowledge what I did. When I look at that serpent, I say, this is the result of my rebellion. And when I look to that, when I come humbly, he forgives. And Jesus, at the outset of his ministry in John chapter 3, when Nicodemus is asking, how do I be right with God? Jesus says, you have to be born again. It's not something you do, it's something God does to you. And then he explains, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him would have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. That passage we know so well, John 3:16, is rooted in John 3:15, where Jesus says that serpent raised in the wilderness, that was a picture of me. That your rebellion against God has led to a sickness unto death. And yet I will not stand aloof from your suffering, I will take it. Not only did I live the perfect life in the wilderness, you did not, I will take your sin and I will be lifted up on a tree. And so when you humbly acknowledge your sin and look at me, that humility is healing, that I will give you life. I will give you forgiveness. I will give you hope in a future. We're meant to remember the Son of God who came for us to heal us. And then finally, he says, remember that God is the one who brought you water from the rock, that there was a flinty rock, and when it was struck, it brought forth life in the wilderness. Paul told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 10, that rock was Christ, that Jesus Christ was struck so that he might pour forth life that we live. So how are we gonna be people who get better in our tests and not bitter? How are we gonna be people who are educated and prepared for God's call into our life in the midst of trial? It doesn't come by mustering all your self-reliance, but by remembering the one who made you. That we say, I see a Jesus who lived the perfect life for me, and I trust him. I see a Jesus who made a way for my sin. So God is not punishing me ultimately because of my sin, because the chastisement that brought me peace fell on the Son. And Jesus is the water for me in the flinty rock, that I can lean on him to nourish me so that I might live even in a difficult day. I'll tell you, for me, when I was on the floor, I'll close with this. I felt like God does what he likes to do with me. He pushes my prayers past politeness. You know what I'm talking about? When life's easy, we pray polite prayers. Lord, I just thank you for this day. Thank you for this food we're having. May it nourish our bodies. Even though I'm unclear what I'm asking you to do to said food, these are the things one says. Amen, right? And so then I'm on the floor like, God, my back is really hurting, and would you solve it? I know you can take it away. I would like you to do that, please. Hey, God, still here, still hurts. Could you kind of remedy that? I know you could in a moment, just a touch, and I'm healed. Hey, God, still here, it's hurting. Hiccups? Really? And I think when God likes to push me to the edge, he's like, oh, there you are. Okay, we found the edges of your faith, son. Let's talk. And I felt like in that moment, I just got frustrated with him. Why am I in this? Why are you doing this? Why am I on my face when I want to be standing in the sun? Why am I in this pain? And I felt like the Holy Spirit was just prodding me like, keep going, go further, maximize it. Not just your pain, think about all the pain. And I started to do that. I was laying on the floor and I was like, and I'm not the only one in pain tonight. And I started thinking about the world I started imagining the earth and started imagining all the human suffering happening at that very moment. And then I remember in that moment, it dawned on me, my pain, as bad as it is to me, wouldn't even land in the top 10 of human suffering on the planet right in this moment. Mothers losing sons, people being hurt and all across the globe. And I started to get past my little narrow view and started praying for the pain of others, saying, God, the whole world's in pain. I've been worried about the dumbest stuff. Look at all this. Look at the mess that men will do. Look at the pain in the world. Look at the sin and its effects. And I started to pray, God, would you do something? And I felt like in that moment, the Lord really pressed on me, Ben, I have. That I did not stand aloof from your suffering. My son entered it, and he took on your pain in the wilderness on the cross. I have, and I will. I am bringing forward the day where I will wipe away every tear, and I will make a new heavens and a new earth. I see your suffering. I've done something about it, and I will cast it away. But now I'm asking you, my son, to walk with me. I procured this salvation. You are here to proclaim it. A community with a cause, that people would see you trust me even in the midst of the pain. And I got to tell you, what gave me hope and courage, what turned pain into praise, the wilderness into worship for me, was not 3 happy steps. It was a contemplation of an almighty God who sent his loving son. And that's the best thing I can give you. God will test you, not to hurt you, but to help you. And ultimately, his greatest gift is to get you to bow your knee to the Son, who when you look at him, you will become more like him. And the more you are like him, the more you'll live the life you were meant to live as a man or woman under God in his image for his glory.